How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Memches, Daf 48 of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends, your friends. 3 mishnayos today. We're going to learn 3 mishnayos today. The first 2 of them are going to discuss the definition of an asheira. Right? The first one starts, Shalosh asheiras, saying there are 3 types of asheira. Honestly, it's kind of a continuation from yesterday where we had said Shloisha botimin, and we had said Shalosh avonimin. Now we're saying Shalosh asheiras, saying there are 3 types of asheira. They have their own halachis when it comes to being mevatel them. And interestingly, the Gemara on the first Mishnah is going to revolutionize, is going to redefine the machlokes between Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, and the Chachamim regarding Ilan Shenito Ulvasof Avdo, which is going to be very interesting. And the last of the 3 mishnayos is going to discuss benefiting from the shade of an asheira tree. However, that is what we will be discussing on Daf Memches of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Let us hop right in. We are going to begin on Daf Memches Amud Aleph all the way at the top at the Mishnah. Shalish asheiras, saying there are 3 types of asheira trees. Number 1, Ilan Shenito Mitchila L'Shem Avodah Zarah. So of course, a tree that was initially planted as an asheira tree, from the time that it was planted, it was intended to be for Avodah Zarah, in which case, Harezo Asura, of course, it is forbidden. It's Avodah Zarah. It was a tree that was planted for Avodah Zarah is Avodah Zarah. Number 2, Gido Ufislo L'Shem Avodah Zarah. You kind of, you kind of shaped it in some ways. You pruned it, you trimmed off some of the trees with the intention of fixing up, I think, of basically creating an asheira. You took this tree, you want it to be an asheira tree, you took an existing standing tree, you cut off some of the branches, I imagine you kind of made it look nice in some kind of a way, and now this is going to be your asheira tree. So in that case, the hechlif notam ashechlif. So whatever new growth there is, that new growth is going to be Avodah Zarah. So the existing tree will not be Avodah Zarah because you took an existing tree and just kind of transformed into an asheira by pruning it and sculpting it. I think that's probably what pislo means, kind of sculpted it in some way by cutting, which involves cutting trees, cutting branches. So the existing tree remains just a regular tree, but any new stuff sort of prompted by this activity, any new growth therein will be Avodah Zarah. So no tamach shechlip, and if you want to be mevatel that Avodah Zarah, so then just cut off whatever grew, right? Because so when you plant a tree milechatchila to be Avodah Zarah, so the whole geschäft, the ganz geschäft, the whole tree is Avodah Zarah, you're gonna have to chop down the tree, destroy. When you prune a tree to be Avodah Zarah by cutting off some branches to stimulate growth. Stimulate is probably the word I was looking for a minute ago. To stimulate growth, so that stimulated growth will be Avodah Zarah. And if you cut off that stimulated growth, what you're left with is just the core of the tree, which is not Avodah Zarah, the part of the tree that was there prior to the stimulation. And if one would just go over to a tree that is not an Avodah Zarah tree, this is case number 3, and simply put Avodah Zarah underneath the tree, so then if you remove the Avodah Zarah from underneath the tree, so now there's no longer Avodah Zarah underneath the tree, well then, problem solved. So 3 types of asheras. 1 was planted milechatchila to be an asheira. 2 was stimulated new growth to be an asheira, so that new growth is what's considered asheira, but the core of the tree is not. And the third example is where you just hunkered down some Avodah Zarah underneath a tree just remove the Avodah Zarah and all is good. Sheesh, now I'm recording this during the 3 weeks. I can't get a haircut, which doesn't really bother me. Some guy, I went to a shul the other day for mincha, and some guy says, I see you didn't manage to get a haircut before the 3 weeks. And I said, I didn't even think about it, actually. He's like, oh, really? Why not? I'm like, I don't know. I guess I just don't think about these things. Anyways, but the only thing that is a thing is the mustache. That's the one thing I don't really get so much, why people would have a mustache. The mustache is, for me at least, the only high maintenance part of the whole thing. Anyways, so now like my mustache is like getting overgrown and there's nothing I can do about it until 3 weeks is over. Hopefully it'll be over today with Mashiach Tzidkenu. That would be great. Really great. Chevra will all come to Yerushalayim and enjoy Avatiach in the Beis HaMikdash. Maybe we'll Babylon Tom, we'll meet up in the Chutzner of the Beis HaMikdash and we'll eat Avatiach. And white plums or yellow plums. Maybe some figs. All right. Says the Gemara, Amid Rabbi Yanai, v'ushehivrich behirke begufah shel ilan. Oh, okay. So says Rabbi Yanai, that when the Mishnah says in its second clause, Gido ifislo l'shem avodas kechavim, that he's like sculpting it for Avodah Zarah. So it says Rabbi Yanai v'ushehivrich behirkiv b'soch ilan. You have to like hivrich and hirkiv the ilan. Hivrich is, these are two types of like stimulating growth, grafting kinds of things. Hirkiv is like you take a branch and like bend it into the, almost like make it like a U with like the bottom of the U underground. So like you take a branch and like bend it over into the ground and have like a little piece coming back up out of the ground or something. And then that's hivrich, I think. Hirkiv, I think, is you just take a branch and like stick it into an existing tree or something. That's what you have to do in order for it to be considered Avodah Zarah. And Gidol Fislo Tanan. But the Gemara says, wait, but that sounds pretty intrusive, pretty, what's the word I'm thinking of? I'm not sure what to think, but pretty intrusive, I guess. I think maybe that's what I said, but I don't know if it's what I'm thinking of. But anyways, that seems like pretty intense, right? To have to be hivrich, hirkiv. Our Mishnah just said like prune a few branches. That should have been enough. So Elikitma Derbiane Leinin Bitlitma, the Gemara concedes you're taka right. All you have to do is actually just prune some branches, and that could be enough to make the new growth Avodah Zarah. And rather, what Rabbi Yanai was saying was with regard to being mevatel the Avodah Zarah, which is the af al gav, the ivrich v'hirkiv begufah shel ilan, that even in a scenario where one does an invasive operation like hivrich and hirkiv, still you can be mevatel it. Kinato masheichlif shaper dami. As long as you, right, by removing whatever was added in this process, in this hivrich and hirkiv process, just remove whatever you undo whatever was done. Shaper dami, you can be mevatel that Avodah Zarah that way, that new growth that way. I may have thought came the hivrich v'hirkiv begufah shel ilan, since he did these hivrich and hirkivs in the tree itself. So I may have thought kilan shenitom utchila dami v'litza kula. I might think it's as if it was a tree that was planted milichatchila. It's the word I'm thinking of is I feel like I'm missing the word that I need. But it's such a invasive, such a intense activity, meaning to prune a few branches, okay, fine, so prune a few branches, and whatever growth was stimulated by the pruning, so remove that stimulated growth, and whatever Avodah Zarah growth there was has been removed, and all good. But I may have thought that when you take a branch and mamash stick it into the tree itself, or kind of use this hivrich kind of thing to create like almost like a new offshoot, maybe that would be considered like more significant to the tree. Maybe you'd have to destroy the whole tree. Maybe just removing the new growth should be insufficient. Even in that case, however, just get rid of the new growth and you're all good. You don't have to destroy the entire tree. That is what Rabbi Yanai is teaching, that even in that scenario, remove the new growth, and all good. So now Shmuel says something very interesting. Who wants to hear what Shmuel has to say? Shmuel says, Shmuel, Hamashtachve le'ilon tosefte asura. Okay. Okie dokie. Says Shmuel that somebody who bows down to a tree, tosefte asura, the new growth is asur. Okay. Why is this so significant? Again, what did Shmuel say? Shmuel said that if somebody goes to an existing tree, right? Essentially, it's Netel Sofabzo, right? He goes to a tree that was planted not for Avodah Zarah, and a person goes to that tree and bows down to the tree. And says Shmuel that now that he's bowed down to the tree, any subsequent growth will be Avodah Zarah. So that sounds like Netel Sofabzo. You have a tree that was initially planted not for Avodah Zarah. Somebody then went out, or somebody went and served it as Avodah Zarah, and now any future growth is now Avodah Zarah. Nital v'sof abdo asur, it sounds like. The wind must be blowing outside. So again, Omar Shmuel says, Shmuel, Hamashtach ve'le'ilon, somebody who bows down to a tree, tosefte, any subsequent growth, asura, is forbidden. Mosiv Rabbi Elazar asakasha gido ufislo lavodas kochavim vehechlif noto mashehechlif gido fislo in no gido fislo lo. So the Gemara asakasha, Rabbi Elazar asakasha, he says, wait a second, if you look at our mishnah, judging from our mishnah, bowing down to a tree shouldn't quite be enough to make subsequent growth awesome, right? Our mishnah had said, yeah. So, a few minutes ago we were talking about hibrich, v'hirkiv. We were talking about mamish, like invasive activity to the tree, like sticking a branch into the goof of a tree. Okay, that's next level. But our mishnah talked about pruning a tree, doing something to the tree, removing branches, doing something to the tree. Shmuel's coming along and say, simply bowing down to the tree is sufficient to make it Avodah Zarah, so that any subsequent growth would now be Avodah Zarah. So Rabbi Elazar says, how does that align with our mishnah? Because our mishnah says you at least have to do Giddo Fisla, you have to do something to the tree. Shmuel seems to be a little bit too, his sort of entry, level of entry, threshold of entry or whatever, is a little bit easy, a little bit too easy. Again, Shmuel says, Shmuel, Hamishach v'le'ilon tosefte asur, somebody who so little as bows down to a tree, any future growth is asur, is Avodah Zarah. Moshe Rabbi Elazar asakasha. Our mishnah says that at least gidlo ufisto navodos kuchavim, that if you pruned it and sculpted it somehow, I hope that pislo means sculpted. I'm going to say it means sculpted. If I'm not right, let me know. And then there was new growth. If you remove whatever new growth, and then you've removed that Avodah Zarah. But Giddo Fislo, in lo Giddo Fislo lo, you at least have to Giddo Fislo, you at least have to do something to the tree. Simply bowing down to the tree will be insufficient. So Omar lach Shmuel, so Shmuel will respond, Hamani Rabbanani u'Shmuel do'Omer Rabbi Yosi Rabbie Yehudah Damar ilan shenitol v'sof avdo aser. Interesting. So the Gemara says, well, you can, I have a solution. I have a solution. You know what my solution is, says the Gemara? My solution is, the concept of nitol v'sof avdo is a machlekes that we learned about, I think maybe 3 days ago. I think it was my Mehamud Beis. Maybe. Why not? Yeah. My Mehamud Beis, where I'm in Chasam and Aleph. So I guess that was 3 days ago. We learned about the machlokes about nitol v'sof avdo. If you plant the tree for Avodah Zarah and then subsequently worship it, the Chacham said mutter. Rabbi Yosi Rabbie Yehudah said aser. So therefore, the Gemara says, simple answer. Our mishnah is the Rabbanan. Our mishnah says that you would have to do something to the tree You have to prune it, do something to it, in order for the subsequent growth to be also. That is the opinion of the Rabbanon, of the rabbis, who say that bowing down would not be enough. Nitolavos of Avdo is mutter. And Shmuel, who says bowing down to the tree and his subsequent growth is also, he's like Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, who says Nitolavos of Avdo is also. So let's really get inside. Shmuel will respond, Amani, who's the author of our mishnah who requires Gido Fislo? Rabbanani, that's the rabbis who say that Nitolavos of Avdo is mutter, and therefore you'd have to be Gido Fislo, bowing down is insufficient. Ushmuel the Amar Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah, and Shmuel says Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah the Amar who says Ilan Nitolavos of Avdo aser, that Nitolavos of Avdo is aser, and therefore Shmuel says bowing down to a tree makes all subsequent growth aser. But Maskef Rav Ashi, Rav Ashi asks a Gavaldic Kasha. He says that that's lame, that answer. Rav Ashi says that answer is lame. Why is that answer lame? Who wants to rule like a das yochid? It's so lame to say that Shmuel came along and says anybody who bows down to a tree, subsequent growth is upser, because that's what Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah says. That makes no sense. We all know yochid v'rav malacha kirab. That when you have machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah, who do we paskin like, friends? Obviously, we paskin the Chachamim. Why would Shmuel? It's so lame to understand Shmuel that the way that we understand Shmuel, or the way to understand Shmuel, is to say that he holds like Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah. That's so lame because it's basically to throw Shmuel in the garbage. Basically, is unusable. His sheet is unusable, right? His sheet is like a das yochid. Okay, fine, we can understand his sheet. It's like a das yochid, but it also makes his sheet irrelevant. So it says Rav Ashi, that's lame. There's got to be a better way, says Rav Ashi. Maskav Rav Ashi asks, says, Mimai de Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah v'Rabbanan b'Tosefes pligei. So Rav Ashi suggests something gevaldik, which changes the whole way that we think about Nitolavos of Avdo. Rav Ashi suggests that actually, you know what, maybe everybody agrees. Across the board. Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, Rabbanan, everybody agrees that if a person goes to a tree that was not planted to be an Avodah Zarah tree, but one goes to that tree and bows down to that tree, from now on, any future growth is aser. Everyone agrees. So meaning that whole machlokas that we had 3 days ago, Nitolavos of Avdo, that machlokas is not talking about if a person goes to a tree and bows down to it, future growth would be aser. Everyone agrees to that. You go down to a tree, bow down to a tree that was not planted initially for Avodah Zarah, but you now bow down to the tree. Everyone agrees that future growth will be aser. And therefore, when Shmuel says thatAmishtach Velila and somebody goes and bows down to a tree, any future growth is aser, everybody agrees with that. So Shmuel is not only Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah, Shmuel is according to everybody. So then what's the machlokas between Tanakam, between the Chacham and Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah? Machlokas is what about the tree itself? What about the existing tree? That's the machlokas. The Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah says, Nitolavos of Avdo's puzzle is aser. It means the whole tree is aser. That if somebody bows down to it, so if you have a tree that was planted not for Avodah Zarah, now somebody subsequently at some later point bows down to it, Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah would say, Nitolavos of Avdo aser, the whole tree is aser, not just the future growth, but even existing growth from before them, the whole tree is aser. Whereas the Chacham say Nitolavos of Avdo is mutter, meaning the existing tree is mutter. But everybody agrees that future growth will be aser, and therefore Shmuel is the divrei hakol. That is Rav Ashi's suggestion, which is pretty awesome, right? Right. So again, Maskif Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi asks, Mimai Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah Rabbanan b'Tosefes pligei. How do we know that Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah and the Rabbanan argue? Why are we assuming that they argue about future growth? Dilma Tosefes l'divrei hakol aser. Maybe everybody agrees that when somebody bows down to a tree, future growth is aser. Uvikaru pligei. And the machlokes between Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah and the Chachamim is with regard to the core of the tree itself, the tree that existed prior to the prostration. The Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah sover ikaru nami aser, that when Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah says Nitolavos of Avdo is aser, means the whole tree is now aser. Dichsiv, as the pasuk says, va'ashereim tisufun ba'esh. Now here is where things get really interesting, because what's Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah's raya? Because it says va'ashereim tisufun ba'esh, and ashereim is plural. That means what do you have to burn the whole? When do you have to burn the whole tree in fire? When do you have to destroy the whole tree? Whether it's nita'ol l'tchila l'shem avodas kachavim, or it's nita'ol l'vasof avdo. Either way, it says ashereim plural tisufun ba'esh. You have to burn. Whether it's nital mitchila l'chach or whether it's nital v'sof abdo, Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah would say you have to burn the whole tree. Rabbanan Sabre, the Rabbanan say ikar ilon shari, whereas the rabbis say the core of the tree is permitted. As the pasuk says, "Vasherem tigadeim," you just remove the subsequent growth from the tree, but not the core of the tree. What is an example of a tree where the subsequent growth will be asur, but the core of the tree itself will remain mutter? Have omer ilon shenitol vasof avdo, and that is. So what is a scenario? Then a scenario of when you initially planted it and only later worshipped it, then any future growth will be also, but the core of the tree will remain mutter chevra. Why is that super interesting? Who can tell me why that's super interesting? The answer why it's super interesting is because 3 days ago when we learned about this machlekes between the Chacham and Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah, we said the exact opposite. Punkt fakert. The exact opposite. The Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah Adapka said that B'asherim tisufun ba'esh and B'asherim tigadeun, one is for nitol mitchil l'chach, the other is talking about nitol v'sof avdo. And it was the rabbis who Dafka learned from B'asherim tisufun ba'esh, and they used tigadeun to teach about that you first do like an initial destruction, then conquer Eretz Yisrael, then do root it out. Right, so the other day we were saying that Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah Dafka uses both psukim of Vasherim Tisufun Ba'esh and Vasherim Tigadeun, and the Chacham are only using Vasherim Tisufun Ba'esh, and here we're saying Fakir. Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah is saying Vasherim Tisufun Ba'esh, that there's Vasherim, plural, that whether it's Nital Mitchil or whether it's Nital Vasof Abdo, in both scenarios you have to destroy the whole tree, just Tisufun Ba'esh. And the Chacham say, but wait a second, there's two psukim. There's Vasherim Tisufun Ba'esh, but there's also Vasherim Tigadeun. Vasherim Tisufun Ba'esh is Nitol Mitchil L'chach, and Vasherim Tigadeun is Nitol Vasof Abdo. So mamish, they flip around. So says the Gemara, V'chitema, and if you're going to say, like I just pointed out, Ha lo mitartzin onachi, that 3 days ago, I'm not Daf Memei Amud Beis, we didn't say like this. We actually said the exact opposite in terms of which psukim people are learning out from. So ipuch, Rabbanan l'divrei Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah v'Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah l'divrei Rabbanan. You know what says the Gemara? Flip them around, no problem. Because actually, if you actually look at the brayso from 3 days ago, actually, if you look from Daf Memei Amud Beis, the Gemara had actually asked this itself on Daf Memei Amud Beis, right? The Gemara, if you flip back to the Memei Amud Beis and go about 6, 7, 8 lines or so into the Gemara, it says, "Va'af Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah suffer ilan shenitol v'sof abdo." Also, the Tanya Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah omrim toch shenemar Elohim 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 al gvos v'agvos Elohim shemani dachas gozayim etc. etc. Tamunom v'asherim tisufun ba'esh. That in the brayso of Yosi Rabbi Yehudah, Dafka learned it out from asherim tisufun ba'esh. Only later on, when we had pressed him, how do you know ilan shenitol v'sof abdo? Did we bring up Vasherim Tigadeun? And the Gemara itself had asked, Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah only says Vasherim Tisufun, etc. So Kilo, if we look back on Memei Amud Aleph, the point is Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah there had really himself had only said Vasherim Tisufun Ba'esh. We had added Vasherim Tigadeun for Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah. So now says the Gemara, now actually let's rethink this machlokas between Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah and the Chacham. Let's rethink it, because actually everybody agrees that if somebody bows down to an Avodah Zarah tree, from that point on, any new growth, if somebody bows down to a tree, from that point on, any new growth will be asur. And it's also, right, and therefore the machlokas between the Rabban and Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah is actually only with regard to the core of the tree itself. Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah says that the core of the tree now becomes asur. The Rabban say it remains mutter. And let's also rethink that Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehudah is the one who's learning it out only from Vasherim Tisufun Ba'esh, and the Chachamim are saying Vasherim Tisufun Ba'esh is by Shenitol Mitchila L'chach, and Ba'asherim Tigadeun is for Nitol Levasof of them. So now, the Gemara, Take, asks an interesting kasha. You know what the interesting kasha is? The interesting kasha is that our Mishnah had said, in what scenario is future growth asur chevre? We got all excited. We were like in this whole very exciting sugya now, but we have to remember that we started with the Mishnah today. And in that Mishnah we said, in what scenario is future growth asur? When you prune the tree, future growth is asur, implying that simply bowing down to a tree is not enough to make future growth asur. And if we're saying that everybody agrees that by bowing down to a tree, future growth is asur, then who's the author of our Mishnah? Who's the author of our Mishnah who says that the future growth is also when you prune the tree, but bowing down is insufficient? Lo Rabbanan, lo Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah. It's like neither the Rabbanan nor like Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, because we're saying that everybody agrees that simply bowing down to a tree is enough to make future growth asur. What do you think about that kasha? Where am I? Because if it's the rabbis, below Gido Ufislo Nami, Tosefes Asur. Because we're saying that according to the rabbis, even simply bowing down to the tree is enough to make future growth also. You don't have to prune it. Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, and if we're saying Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, Ikri Nami also, not just future growth is asur. Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah would say the tree itself is asur. If you would say in a scenario of Ishtach Avodah, the tree itself is asur, certainly Gido Fislo, it's not just future growth, there's also with the tree itself is asur. So you buy same Rabbanim, you buy same Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, you can actually say that the Mishnah is fine with both the rabbis and Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah. You buy same Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, I can explain how the Mishnah, how this is how Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah would explain the Mishnah. Kikam Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, below Gido Ufislo, Ikr Ilan Asur Bistama. So when Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah says that by bowing down to a tree, the whole tree becomes asur. By bowing down to a tree, the whole tree becomes asur, according to Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah. That's because he's not specifying any particular part of the tree. He's bowing down to the whole tree, therefore the whole tree becomes asur. Aval Gido Fislo Galiadaiti the Tosefes Nichale Beker Ilan Lo Nichale. But when one prunes, why does one prune? I don't know, I don't prune. But those who do prune, I think they prune in order to stimulate future growth. You prune an area of the tree, or you prune the tree so that now there will be new growth. And therefore, by pruning the tree, you're indicating that you're interested in the new growth. And therefore, Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah would agree that in that case, only the new growth is asur. Where he says that the whole tree is asur is when you bow down, because you're bowing down to the Gan's tree, to the whole tree. Alternatively, I could explain how the Mishnah is the rabbis, Gido Ufislo, it's Trichale, that even though, yes, according to the rabbis, bowing down would be sufficient to make future growth asur, but there's a chiddush to be chiddushed with Gido Ufislo, according to the rabbi, because I may have thought that when you bow down to a tree, then future growth is asur. But when you do something to the tree itself, like prune it and cut off branches, you're actually doing something to the tree, maybe the whole tree would become asur. The rabbis needed to say, no, hold your horses. Even when you prune, only future growth is asur. The tree itself will remain mutter. Givaldig. That was a givaldig chiddush, right? Big time chiddush to say that actually when you bow, right? This whole machlokas that we delved into the other day between the Rabban and Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah about Nitol Vasof Otho, it's actually not as dramatic and drastic as it seemed to be at the time. Actually, everybody agrees that if you bow down to a tree, all future growth is asur. Where they argue is about the existing tree. That's where they argue. Very interesting stuff over there. And now we will learn the second mishnah of our daf. Ezu asheira. What is an asheira? Kol sheyesh tachtea avodas kochavim. If there is beneath it Avodah Zarah. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon kol she'ovdin osa. Yeah, in order for the tree to be considered Avodah Zarah, they would have to worship the tree. Umaise b'tzidon, there was a maise in tzidon be'ilun shayu ovdin also, that there was a tree that apparently they were worshiping the tree, umatzu tachtav gal, but then they actually found that underneath the tree was a mound. Reb Shimon said to them, badku zegal, check the mound, hazeh, this mound. Uvadku, so they did as they were instructed, and they checked out the mound. Umatzubo tzura, and in the mound, they found some kind of a getchke of sorts. So they realized that actually it was not the tree that was being worshipped, even though it seemed that way. In fact, it was the mound. And Reb Shimon then concluded, since what they are worshipping is this getchke, not the tree itself is mutter. Says the Gemara, Ezu asheira va'on shalosh asheras tanat. So the Gemara asks, maybe some of the Talmidei Chacham here at Babylon Talmud were wondering, why are we asking about what an asheira is? We just learned a mishnah on today's very daf that listed the 3 types of asheras. And now we're asking what's an asheira? We literally just said what it is. This is what's going on. Look, the previous mishnah had listed 3 types of asheira trees. 2 of them everyone agrees about. When you plant it milichatchila as an asheira tree, of course it's asur. The whole tree is asur. When there's future growth stimulated for to be an asheira, it's the future growth. But with regard to the last clause, that the 3rd type of an asheira is an asheira tree that has Avodah Zarah underneath it, actually, ba'achas machlekes to Reb Shimon v'Rabbanan. That last one is a machlekes between Reb Shimon and the rabbis. Ezu asheira shenech l'kubo Reb Shimon v'Chacham. What is the asheira that Reb Shimon and the Chacham argue about? Kol sheyesh tachtea avodas kochavim, a tree that has beneath it Avodah Zarah. So the Chacham would say that the tree is considered Avodah Zarah. Reb Shimon Omer kol she'ovdim also. Reb Shimon says it would only be considered Avodah Zarah if they served the tree itself. Ezu asheira stam. Now, for the Gemara, sort of its own question, which is, in what scenario can you assume that a tree is an asheira? Let's go weiter. Rav says, for example, if you have a bunch of, I guess korban would be priests sitting beneath the tree. Basically, you have a bunch of Avodah Zarah people, Ovdei Kochavim, sitting underneath the tree, and yet nobody's touching the fruit. That doesn't make sense. Sitting under a tree, there's fruits. You would think that they would want to eat the fruits, but they're not. They don't dare to touch it. That's an indicator. You can assume that that's an Avodah Zarah tree. Because if it wasn't, they would be reaching for the fruits and eating them. Even if you simply hear them saying about the dates of a particular tree, these dates are for the Avodah Zarah. Also, the whole tree is also the Rami Bei Shichra. It means basically that they are going to use the dates of this tree to make beer that they're going to drink on whatever Yom Tov they have. So I guess that makes the tree itself an asheira tree. That's an indication that the tree itself is an asheira tree. Amar Meimar Amuli Saved de Pumbedisa also Kishmuel says a Meimar that the elders of Pumbedisa. Who are the elders of Pumbedisa? Is that like Eifo Va'avimi? Or no, Saved. Let's actually look that up. Yeah, that's from Saved de Pumbedisa, from Sanhedrin Daf Yud Zayin. I'm going to look that up in a second. But the elders of Pumbedisa told me that the halacha is like Shmuel. Who's the elders of Pumbedisa? I feel like maybe it's Rabbi Yehudah. Nah. Well, I'm going to look that up right now. Okay, so I just looked up Daf Yud Zayin Amabez Masechta Sanhedrin, where it says that Saved de Pumbedisa is Rabbie Yehudah of Rav Eina. It's Rav Yehudah and Rav Eina. Who's Rav Eina? And also, does it make sense that, what does it say? Amar Meimer Amar Saved de Pumbedisa Ilchsa Kishmuel? Well, I feel like Rav Yehudah, yeah. I feel like a Meimar and Rav Yehudah did not overlap. What was the Gemara in Kiddushin on Daf Ayin Beis? Tell me, what was the Gemara in Kiddushin on Daf Ayin Beis? Let's look it up. Kiddushin, where are you? Kiddushin. Kiddushin. Here you are. Okay. Well, what does the Gemara say in Kiddushin Adaf Ayin Beis? I probably should know it by now, but it says, Kiddushin Adaf Ayin Beis, Kishmeis Rabbi Akiva nolad Rabbi, Kishmeis Rabbi nolad Rabbie Yehudah, Kishmeis Rabbie Yehudah nolad Rava. The Gemara in Kiddushin Adaf Ayin Beis says that when Rabbie Yehudah died, Rava was born, and a Maimar was a Maimar not like a Maimar and Rav Ashi? Was it not like around Rav Ashi? So I feel like a Maimar would not have overlapped with Rav Yehudah, but maybe Rav Eina. Who's Rav Eina? I don't really know who that is. Maybe he came later. So maybe Savi Pupadisa, when it refers to Rav Eina, maybe a Maimar could have overlapped with Rav Eina. I don't know who that is. Really. Says the Mishnah and Daf Mem Ches Amud Beis all the way at the top. Lo yeshiv b'tzila v'lo yeshiv v'myoshav tar v'lo yaver tachtea v'maver tamei hoysa gozel sesarabim v'aver tachtea tar. Okay, so first of all, friends, any tumah related to an asheira is only midirabanan. Okay, Avodah Zarah related tumah is not midoraisa. Touching a corpse, of course, is or a sheretz. Right? These are tumah doraisas. Tumah related to Avodah Zarah is midrabanan. Now, says the Mishnah, let's do it again. Lo yeshiv b'tzila v'myoshav tar. Do not sit in its shade. So shade here. Now the Mishnah continues and says, V'lo yaver tachteh v'maver tameh. Right. So the Mishnah says that if you walk underneath an asheira tree, you will become tameh. Okay, tameh midrabanan, but you'll become tameh. I assume it means ad erev. I assume it means just go to the mikvah and then you're Torah. It could even be immediately. I don't really know how to become pure from Tuma Dirabanan. I assume it's maximum just till the evening. But anyways, we said that if you walk under, it says the Mishnah that if you walk underneath an asheira tree, you become Tameh. So when it says don't sit in its shade, and if you sit in its shade, you are Tahor, clearly that's not talking about like sitting underneath the branches, because we said if you walk underneath an asheira tree, you're tummy. What it means is the shadow of an asheira tree. Do not sit in the shadows of an asheira tree, and if you do, you are tahor, because the shadows is not the shade of the tree itself. And do not walk beneath an asheira tree, underneath its like branches. And if you do pass through, you are but if the asheira tree was infringing on the public domain, so let's say some guy on his property has it as a tree that he worships for Avodah Zarah, and it's an asheira tree, but the branches hang over Rishus Harabim, and so now what? People can't walk underneath the tree in Rishus Harabim because some guy in his property decided to worship for Avodah Zarah. No, so Rishus Harabim, it says if it was stealing from the public domain, and you pass underneath the trees, you are tahor. I was taka in, where was I the other day? I was in like Sanhedria, somewhere in Yerushalayim. There's a Beis HaKvaris over there, and taka, there was signs there that says Kohanim do not walk here. It was outside of the Beis HaKvaris, but the Beis HaKvaris is like mamish in the city. If you go to, I think it's Sanhedria or Ramat Eshkol, something like that. So there's literally a Beis HaKvaris like in the middle of Yerushalayim in that area, and I guess I was walking outside of the Beis HaKvaris, and there was signs saying Kohanim don't walk here. I think the concern is that they can walk under trees. So this says the Gemara something a little bit technical. Hopefully I'll read it smoothly. Lo yeshiv b'tzila, okay, don't sit in its shadows. Pshita, okay, of course you shouldn't be sitting in its shadows. So first of all, there are two types of shadows, okay? There's tzel komasa and there's tzel tzila. Tzel komasa, this is of course only if I understand it correctly. Tzel komasa is basically if the tree is, 30 feet tall, so the first 30 feet of its shadow is tzel komasa. The shadow that directly has a one-to-one relationship with the height of the tree. Tzel tzila is past that, right? If the sun is hitting the tree from a certain angle, the shadow could be even more than 30 feet. If it's a 30-foot tree, it could be even more than that. So once you get past 30 feet, though, the shadow is a shadow of its former self. Pun intended. And pun intended, no pun intended. I don't know what was intended. But when it gets further than the actual height of the tree itself, it's like a weaker shadow, and that's what's called tzel tzilo. So it's tzel komaso in Tzel Tzila. So now says the Gemara, Lo Yeshiv B'Tzila Pshita. Obviously, you shouldn't sit in its shadow. I mean, if it's hot outside, the sun's on you. Oh wow, there's the shadow of a tree. Let me go there. Of course, you're getting benefit from a asheira. Of course, you shouldn't do that. Well, the chiddush here is that you shouldn't even sit in its tzel tzila, the shadow in that sort of secondary, or that weaker shadow. But if you did, you are tahor. Does that imply that? And if you're talking about tzel komaso, the stronger shadow, you'd be tameh, even though it's just the shadow? Lo. No, even if you sit in the stronger shadow, the tzel komaso, you would also be tahor. But the chiddush here is that the afilu the tzel tzila lo yeshe. But the chiddush here is that even if we're talking about the tzel tzila, the weaker shadow, still we're saying lo yeshe. You still shouldn't sit there. Ikadam demas nilo aseifa. Those who teach it about the seifa, about v'im yoshav tahor. V'im yoshav tahor pshita. Obviously, if you sat there, you are tahor. Amar Rabbi Bachana. Amar Yochanan l'nitzcha elu l'tzel komasa. Well, it's dafka needed to teach that by tzel komasa, if you sit there, you are tahor. Does that imply that if we're saying that, and if by tzel komasa, the stronger shadow, if you sit there, you are tahor, does that imply that by tzel tzila, the weaker shadow, you can even sit there milichatchila? No. No. Don't sit in the shadow of an asheira tree ever. Tzel komasa, tzel tzila, but the chiddush here is that even by tzel komasa, the stronger shadow, if you sat there, you are tahor. And do not pass underneath the asheira tree, and if you do, you are tamei. My time, how come? Because under an asheira tree, there must be tekroves avodas kochavim, and that will be matami ba'oil. And the tree is going to be in oil over the tekrovas avodas kochavim, the offering of Avodah Zarah. Money, who is this? Rabbi Yehudah ben Beseira. So Rabbi Yehudah ben Beseira Desanya, Rabbi Yehudah ben Beseira Omer, minayin the tekrovas avodas kochavim shemtam ba'oil. How do we know that offerings of Avodah Zarah are matame ba'oil? Shenemar, as the Bible says, vayitzmedu levalpor. That's Avodah Zarah. Vayorchlu vazivche mesim. They ate the offerings of the dead. Mames matame ba'oil. Have tekrovas avodas kochavim matame ba'oil. Just like a corpse is mitame be'oil, so are offerings of Avodah Zarah. Therefore, if you walk underneath an Avodah Zarah tree, an asheira, you will be tameh, because the assumption is that there are Avodah Zarah offerings underneath the tree. Where am I? If the asheira tree was stealing from the public domain, i.e., it was over the public domain, and what now? What now? People can't walk under the tree. So if they do, they're tahor. Over. Is it b'diavad or lechatchila? If there's a asheira tree overhanging the public domain, is it that if b'diavad you passed under the asheira tree, you are tahor, but lechatchila you should not? Or does it even mean even lechatchila you could pass underneath the tree? I mean, what gives? What gives the right of this person to have his tree overhanging the Rosh Hashanah? That tuma of an asheira tree is anyways midarabanan. Well, not anyways midarabanan. Midarabanan is obviously super important, but meaning the point is that the tuma of the asheira tree is midarabanan, and when the Rabbanan made their gezerah, perhaps they excluded when a private asheira tree is stealing from the Rosh Hashanah. Maybe in that case, you can even lechatchila pass under the tree. Rabbi Yosi ben Elazar mishmei dechizka amar over milechatchila. Rabbi Yochanan amar im avar, which is bidi even. And actually, there's no machlokas here. Hadika dircha achrina, hadleka dircha achrina. It just depends. If there's an alternate route, well then it's only bidi even to walk underneath the asheira tree. Then take the alternate route that doesn't have the asheira tree. But if there's no alternate route, so then you can even lechatchila go under the asheira tree. Tosfos points out that when we talk about an alternate route, it means an alternate route that is just as long and takes the same amount of effort as the as the route with the asheira tree. If it's a longer route, well then Tosfos says ein l'davar sof. There's always another way that you can go in most scenarios. It just might not be practical. We're saying if there's a practical alternative, well then take that practical alternative. Rav Sheshes says to his attendant, Rav Sheshes of course was blind, so he would have an attendant who would walk with him and aid him. That when you get to the place where there's an asheira tree, run. What exactly is the scenario? If there's no other way to go, why do you need to run? There's no other way to go. Mishnah Shari is entirely permitted in that case. If there's an alternative route, just going faster, does that make it any better? There's an alternative route. You need to take the alternative route. Don't just go quickly under the not allowed route. The answer is look, really there is an alternative. There is not an alternative route, and this was the only way to go. Okay, then why do you have to run? I mean, you go under the tree. There's no alternative because he's an adam chashuv. Because Rav Sheshes was an important person, so therefore it's different, and he wanted to just pass under it as quickly as possible. That was Daf Mem Ches of Masechta Avodah Zarah. We learned 3 mishnayos. The first mishnayos talk about different kinds of asheira trees, and we totally rethinked the way, right, the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, and we said that actually everybody agrees that if one bows down to a asheira tree from that point on, that the new growth is asur. That actually the machlokas in the Chachamim and Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah, that when Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehudah says Ilan Chenatol of Sofa was asur, it means the ikar of the tree itself, whereas when the Chachamim say mutter, it means the tree itself remains asur mutter, just that the future growth is asur. And then we talked about sitting in the shadows of an asheira tree and the tumah of an asheira tree if you walk underneath it, but if it's in the public domain, it's okay. If there's an alternative route, you should take it. That was Daf Mem Ches of Masechta Avodah Zarah. I hope you enjoy. Peace out.